In my last video, I talked about why OFWs aren't heroes, but victims, and how that label of quote-unquote hero is really just a coping mechanism. Not just for them, but for the families they leave behind. But there's one thing I didn't talk about. Why do so many of our brightest minds go abroad? And I don't just mean the blue-collar workers, I mean everyone. From housemaids to managers, from seamen to scientists, why does it seem like everyone's dream is to leave? And worse, why does the government encourage this type of behavior? Well, it all comes down to one thing: the failure of Filipino economic policy. The Philippines is rich in natural resources. However, many of these resources were, and still are, difficult to access, were also available elsewhere in the world, or were simply less profitable than commodities such as oil, rubber, or tin. And that is one thing you can see very clearly in how the colonizers viewed the Philippines. To them, the value of the Philippines was mostly in the location. With all things equal, the Philippines was more so a bane than a boon for Spain, America, or Japan. The Spanish peak era was a prime example of this economic paradox. A colony rich in resources, yet poor in importance. The Philippines had plenty to offer, but not what Spain actually needed. Sure, the Philippines had abaca, timber, and gold. It could grow rice, coconuts, sugar, and tobacco. But Spain simply had these resources elsewhere and could extract, grow, and transport them back to the metropole cheaper and faster. The Americas had gold, the Caribbean had sugar and tobacco, British India and the Dutch East Indies had spices, and the list goes on. Our products just weren't essential or profitable, so instead of developing us, Spain simply maintained us. Spain's goal wasn't to build a thriving local economy or to mold the Philippines into something like Spain, like it did with the Americas. It was to keep order, collect taxes, and ensure the colony paid for itself, given its lack of important resources and sheer distance from Spain. To do that, they handed power and land to a small, loyal elite. They ushered in the beginning of the hacienda system, large estates owned by elites or friars. Chances are, if you head into the province, see a massive farm or estate titled hacienda something, it probably dates back to the Spanish era. The simple fact that these haciendas exist even today is concerning to me, to be honest. This would solidify the hierarchy in Philippine society that still persists today, with the land-owning elites on the top and the peasant farmers at the bottom. The only thing even lifting the Philippines up for most of its existence was the galleon trade, a series of ships carrying goods from Acapulco in Mexico to Manila. But even then, it was not enough to promote local growth. As the world moved on into the industrial era, Spain discouraged large-scale local industries to avoid competition with the metropole. High taxes and forced labor kept people poor. Economic reform and national sentiment was crushed. And despite having the oldest extant university in Asia since 1611 with UST and having the first public educational system with the education decree of 1863 ahead of even Japan, it focused on religion, not technical or economic knowledge. Despite all this, it would be unfair to say that the Philippines saw no progress under Spain. The late Spanish period, particularly after the 1830s, brought with it a wave of reforms and global integration. The opening of ports to international trade connected the islands to the wider world, allowing exports like sugar, abaca, and tobacco to flourish. Foreign merchants and local elites amassed wealth. New infrastructure appeared, and cities like Manila, Iloilo, and Cebu grew rapidly. For a moment, it seemed like the Philippines was finally stepping into the modern era. But this growth was shallow and unequal. The wealth went to the same friar estates and elite families who had always controlled the land, while the ordinary Filipino remained trapped in debt and poverty. The economy expanded, but its foundation stayed feudal, dependent on exports, foreign capital, and the whims of the global market. Spain's modernization came too late, and when it finally arrived, it benefited the few at the expense of the many. When the Americans took over in 1898, they didn't inherit a blank slate, they inherited a broken system. Centuries of Spanish control had left the Philippines with weak industries, vast inequality, and a land-owning elite clinging to power. And instead of dismantling that system, the United States decided to manage it more efficiently. The Americans presented themselves as modernizers, the ones who would prepare the Philippines for democracy, education, and progress. Now, keyword quote-unquote prepare. And to their credit, they did modernize parts of the colony. They introduced public infrastructure, English education, civil service, and new industries. Railways, schools, and bureaucracies expanded at a pace never seen under Spain. For the first time, the Philippines saw itself as part of the modern world, at least on the surface, that is. The Americans didn't want an independent economy, they wanted a complementary one. The Philippines was turned into a supplier of raw goods for American factories and a consumer of American products. Our industries weren't built to compete with the US, they were built to serve it, and that still applies today. During this time, sugar, coconut oil, abaca, and tobacco dominated our exports. American corporations and Filipino elites formed close ties, ensuring that profits flowed upward, not outward. It's also during this era that the foundations of economic inequality became institutionalized. The same elite families from the Spanish era, now speaking English and educated in American schools, adapted perfectly to the new system. They became the face of quote-unquote Filipino capitalism, even though they were, in reality, middlemen for American interests. By the 1920s and 1930s, the Philippines experienced what many historians call the pre-war economic boom, a period of relative prosperity. Manila became one of Asia's most modern cities, rivaling even Tokyo and Shanghai in cosmopolitan life. There were new banks, electric streetcars, film theaters, and international trade houses. Agricultural exports surged, the peso was strong, and business confidence was high. On paper, it looked like the Philippines was finally catching up. But this boom was fragile. It wasn't driven by domestic industry, but by favorable access to the US market. In essence, the American colonial economy was built on preferential trade laws that let Philippine goods enter the US tariff-free, while keeping the archipelago dependent on American imports. It wasn't a partnership, it was a hierarchy. And when the Great Depression hit in 1929, that illusion of prosperity shattered. Export prices collapsed, workers were laid off, and entire rural economies dependent on sugar and abaca suffered. The Philippines learned the hard way that its growth was never truly its own. It's conditional, external, and easily destroyed. Even as independence loomed in 1946, nothing changed structurally. The Americans had given the Philippines democracy, but not economic sovereignty. We had politicians, elections, and a flag, but our industries, trade, and even education still revolved around the United States, which is another thing I have grabsed, but I'll talk about some other time. Filipino entrepreneurs struggled to compete with imported goods, while land reform remained a dream buried under elite opposition. The result? A country that was politically free but economically shackled, a republic that inherited the same colonial skeleton, just under a new flag. So when World War II came and devastated the islands, the supposed golden age of the pre-war Philippines was exposed for what it really was, a fragile illusion built on dependency. Factories were gone, trade was halted, and the economy collapsed overnight. We rebuilt after the war, but we didn't reinvent ourselves. By the time independence finally arrived, the Philippines was once again in debt, reliant on foreign aid, and exporting the same goods it had a century earlier. The Americans may have taught us democracy, but they also perfected our dependency, turning the Philippines into a model colony of the modern world. Modern, educated, outwardly successful, yet economically powerless. So, yeah, that's pretty much how centuries of colonization shaped and in many ways limited the foundation of the Philippine economy, from Spain's rigid control to America's economic manipulation and even Japan's brief but brutal occupation. Every empire left its mark. Each one promised progress, but all of them built a system designed to keep us dependent. And that's exactly what we inherited after independence, a country that looked modern on the outside, but was still trapped in the same old colonial framework. But that's a story for part 2. Because while the colonial powers may have started the cycle, what came after independence was something we did to ourselves. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.